My name is James Heinzen. I'm a professor of history here at Rowan University, and I'm also the director of Rowan's Holly Bush Institute for Global Peace and Security. And I'm going to speak today for about 15 minutes, and then Dr. Markowitz will do the same. And we're going to talk about the situation in Ukraine as we understand it. We're going to talk about what Putin had in mind, what his goals may be, about sort of the situation in Russia and in Ukraine domestically, the question of sanctions, and anything else that you would like to talk about. This is very much an ongoing situation that's developing. And I think that things will look a lot different in a week. So you have to sort of bear with us. We're talking about a moving target here. We can't keep up with every last development in Ukraine, but we're happy to lend our sort of perspective that we have as specialists in the area. We are going to speak until about 6:30. If people want to stick around that long, we'll stick around that long to answer questions. If you have questions after our presentation, then just use that raise hand function and we'll call on you. If you don't want to raise your hand, so if you use the raise hand function, we'll call on you, we'll ask you to unmute yourself and to turn on your video to ask the question. If you don't want to speak publicly like that, you can type your question in the Q&A box, and James and Kathy will be monitoring that and will pose us the questions then. So I just want to give a quick sort of background statement so we're all on the same page a little bit. So in the last 7 days, Russia under Putin has engaged in an unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. A force of nearly 200,000 troops spent several weeks gathering at the border, and that army has finally invaded Ukraine. Ukrainian forces and citizens have put up a remarkably valiant fight, but Russia continues to move deeper into Ukraine, and many cities have been surrounded. There are serious questions about Ukraine's future. There's been a concerted response from the United States, from the European Union, from NATO, including a very intensive package of sanctions. So just to say right away, this invasion is tragic. It's mind-boggling, even for academics who spend a lot of time studying the region. I want to preface my remarks with one quick plea. I know a lot of us are angry and frustrated about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but it's important, I think, to separate our anger at Putin and the Russian government decision makers from our attitude towards average Russian people who did not make this decision. This is a dictatorship. Let's not blame ordinary people. This is all on Putin. This is a conflict that will be bad for both countries, for Russia and Ukraine. The trajectory of both countries has changed fundamentally forever. And a lot of innocent people are going to suffer, and both sides have lost lives. So, and also here in the United States, I'm a little disturbed by some reports I'm seeing that some people are hassling Russian-speaking people or people with Russian accents. There are people who are boycotting Russian restaurants or boycotting Russian stores in the United States. And I really hope that we don't do that, that we understand that most Russians here are citizens. They are as American as I am. So to move on, over the weekend, I was at a conference of Russian and Ukraine specialists in Richmond, Virginia, and that conference coincidentally began the day after the invasion. There were historians and political scientists and sociologists there, and most everyone was shocked that Putin moved so quickly into a full invasion. It was, to say the least, a very unhappy conference. And so I want to talk a little bit about what Putin has in mind with this invasion as I understand it. Many people have been asking me why Putin invaded Ukraine, and they asked me what his goals are. And I want to talk a little bit about that from the perspective of a historian. So Putin has claimed that this is about threats to Russian security, that the expansion of NATO, the NATO military alliance, poses, he says, a threat to Russia's current security, to its very existence. And of course, Russia, like any country, has legitimate security concerns. But if we judged by his speeches justifying the invasion, he made two, one on February 20th and one on February 23rd. We can see in these speeches that this is not really about NATO. We can see by the fact of the invasion itself, that is, that he invaded at all, that this is not about NATO. And if we judge by the way the war is being prosecuted, it's certainly no longer about NATO expansion. To resolve these security issues with the West would require Russia to negotiate through international bodies. But Putin has chosen not to negotiate. Russia has chosen not to negotiate. So what is this war about? What are the goals? And the bottom line, in my view, is that this war is about the destruction of the Ukrainian state and its independent status. This is about attempting to end the possibility that Ukraine will be a democracy that will have an independent foreign policy that's oriented towards the West. And this is being done by attempting to destroy the very idea of Ukraine as an independent state, either now or in the past. So Putin, both of his speeches were full of historical, analysis in his mind. And Putin has weaponized history. He's using historical justifications that are false, but they give us a sense of his worldview and help to answer the question why Putin has decided to invade and why Ukraine. So let's talk about what Mr. Putin has said about why the war was necessary. By the way, a quick plug for history. There's never been a better lesson about why people need to study history than this situation. So respect to our history majors and to other students of history out there, no matter what your age. Let's think about the answers to these questions. We need to think about Russian history according to Vladimir Putin. And we're gonna just do I just wanna do a quick examination of a couple of the points he made in these speeches. We won't go into the details, which Putin in his speeches dwelled on rather garishly. But so in his televised speech on Sunday, February 20th, Putin provided his historical justification for the invasion of Ukraine, which would be launched 3 days later. In the speech, he gave a false and bizarre version of Ukrainian history that served as his ideological justification for the dismemberment of the country. He declared that Ukraine, which has been an independent democracy for 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, had no right to be a sovereign, independent nation. He said that Vladimir Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, gave Ukraine the right to be a separate republic in 1922, but this is false. In fact, Lenin's government subsumed the Ukrainian territories into the Soviet Union. They deprived it of any independence whatsoever in a more of a colonial relationship. And in any case, what happened in 1922, and yes, that's 100 years ago, is irrelevant to current Ukraine's status as an independent nation. Perhaps more importantly, Putin talked a lot about the year 1991 and 1992, which is when the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, in fact, Ukraine's borders were established in 1991. Ukraine's borders as an independent country. After the fall of communism, in 1991, the Soviet Union broke up into 15 different countries. Russia itself signed treaties recognizing these new borders. So Putin said that Russia gave Ukraine its independence, but that's not true. Ukraine voted for independence from Russia in 1991. 90% of the population voted for independence. So he then talked about what he wants to do now and how he's going to do that. So what it seems like is that Putin wants to establish a kind of permanent domination, or at least major influence over Ukraine, over its internal matters, over its foreign policy. He may even want to establish this domination of over all or most of the former territories of the Russian Empire. Putin has a very imperial notion of the Slavic lands of the former Russian Empire. So that the former Slavic lands of the former Russian Empire would be Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. He believes that these three currently independent countries are basically all one grand Slavic nation that should be under Russian domination. In his reading of history, Ukraine and Belarus do not have the right to exist as independent nations. So when justifying the campaign, he also said that the current military operation into Ukraine is a denazification campaign. This is the word he's been using, denazification. So what does he mean by a denazification campaign? Our best analysis is that this means, what it obviously means is that he believes that Ukraine's leaders are Nazis or pro-Nazis or fascists or support fascists or are supported by fascists or all of the above. This means that there has to be forced violent regime change by killing or capturing and putting on trial or imprisoning the current leadership of the country under the guise that they are neo-Nazis leading a fascist junta that has undertaken, as he puts it, genocide against Russian speakers in the eastern part of the country. So this false idea that Ukraine is committing genocide against the Russian-speaking population justifies the removal of its government as Nazis, including its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, in this process of denazification. So this is a very cynical and bizarre idea, not least of which because, as most of you probably know, Zelensky is himself Jewish and his grandparents were killed by real Nazis in the Holocaust. The government hasn't even tried to produce evidence that there is a genocide against Russians in the Eastern Territory, although he's been saying this since about 2011. Ultimately, Putin's idea is to eliminate Ukraine as its neighbor. That Putin does not want a pluralist, Western-looking, democratic, independent entity on its border, whose very existence and whose success poses a threat to Mr. Putin, the dictator. So another key sort of part of the backdrop of this invasion is the humiliation that Russia suffered when the Cold War ended in 1991. And Russia basically lost the Cold War. There's really no other way to interpret that phenomenon. And as a result, Russia lost a huge portion of its territory. It lost its Eastern Empire, that is its Eastern European sort of outer empire, and it also lost its inner empire, the republics that it had carved out of the territory surrounding it. I lived in Russia at that time. I was a graduate student in 1991 and 1992, when by coincidence, I was accepted to do my dissertation work in the Soviet Union. By the time I got there, it had become a different country. The economy tanked when I lived there in the fall of 1991, and especially beginning in January 1992, much worse than it has in this past week. Inflation in the United States is now something like 6.5% annually. People are freaking out about it. In 1992, the inflation rate in Russia was over 2,000%. This meant that middle-class people lost their savings, that pensions were worthless for senior citizens, and the collapse was terrible for the Russian people. There was a massive economic depression. The United States was actually providing humanitarian aid to its old superpower enemy. And after being a superpower since World War II, this was a national humiliation and a great sense of weakness. And Russia became really irrelevant as a power outside its borders for at least a decade. And this caused a backlash. Some people in the military and in the security services never got over this national humiliation. And they wanted to reassert Russian power and greatness in the world. They weren't content with being like a junior partner to Europe and the United States. And Putin was one of these people. Putin was a KGB officer in East Germany in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke apart. And over time, especially after Putin became the president in 2000, he wanted to revise this post-1991 situation. He wanted to roll back NATO, And eventually Russia gained the military strength to be able to try to do that, to try to challenge the existing order in Europe. And one could say that Putin sort of wages war in the present to purge the past. And this is a type of language that he uses, and he used in his speech justifying this invasion, that Russia had become weak after 1999, after 1991, was a victim of Western aggression. And it seems that he, in part, thinks of this war against Ukraine, which he says is completely controlled by the United States and NATO internally. It's false. That this is a way of sort of purging these resentments and grievances caused by the collapse of the country in 1991. So the other thing, and then I'll wrap up, is that it's interesting to see how he talks about the relationship between Russia and Ukraine in these speeches. He puts Ukraine in the position of Germany in 1941. And he said that Ukraine was about to attack Russia the way that Germany attacked the Soviet Union at the beginning of World War II. So he compares Ukraine with Nazi Germany. This is, so that they are proactively attacking Ukraine before Ukraine, the fascists of Ukraine, attack Russia. This is a fantasy, but a powerful one. So I want to just conclude right now. Historians are not good at making predictions. So I'm not going to make a prediction. I'm just going to make an observation. I think that ironically, this military effort to reverse some of the effects of the 1991 collapse and the fall and the depression and the loss of Russian power in the world, his effort to reverse this through military means will probably throw Russia into another deep depression, thanks to the sanctions that are already starting to hit the Russian economy rather severely. And so this is a kind of paradox. Reverse the effects of 1991 by driving Russia into another similar situation. And we see the same paradox that just as the attempt to weaken Ukraine's connection with Europe, his idea that if he invades Ukraine, this will weaken Ukraine and weaken the ties with Europe. In fact, that has also done the opposite. It's brought Europe closer to Ukraine than ever before. He's sort of driven Ukraine into the arms of Europe, and that's permanent. That will never be reversed. So thank you for your attention. I now want to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Larry Markowitz.
Great, thank you. As Professor Heidensen said, thank you. As Professor Heidensen said, I'm Lawrence Markowitz. I'm Professor of Political Science, and I focus on Russia, Central Asia, post-Soviet states. So I'll speak a little bit about some of the current developments and try to put this in a broader framework so we can maybe try to make sense of many of the developments that are occurring over the past 7 days, maybe over the past 10 days. I think we've all witnessed a series of rapid developments that have upended our understanding of world order, and in many ways upended how we basically think life is supposed to be. I think it's not a stretch to say that many of us find these developments distressing, confusing, and sometimes, in some cases, downright scary. And I see there being 3 earthquake-like developments that have unfolded over the last week and a half. First, we've seen a shocking disregard for international norms and international law with the invasion of one country by another. Of course, there have been a number of invasions. The US itself has engaged in a lot of incursions and invasions of other countries. But this is the first time since World War II that we've seen a country invade another for the purpose of either destroying that country, occupying that country, absorbing it into itself. And maybe with the exception of Israel, where some states sought to destroy the state of Israel, which is sort of the exception that proves the rule. And so this has just been, I think, a shock in the sense that many of us assumed in the 21st century that international borders are sacrosanct, and the borders, the maps that we have in our textbooks on our walls are not really changing. And this is a point that was illustrated quite vividly by the ambassador to the UN from Kenya, who made this eloquent speech talking about how they're not happy with their borders either, but nobody messes with borders in the international system because it creates untold problems in terms of potential conflict. And I think that's partly why a lot of people misread or did not expect Russia to actually invade, because there was an expectation that these are international borders and an unprovoked invasion would just be unheard of in the 21st century. So that's point number one, is that international norms and international law has been violated. Number two, we're witnessing an extremely high level of violence carried out by one state on the population of another. As Professor Heinzen noted, the Russian military had amassed a large force outside of Ukraine. That includes a whole range of weaponry. For a number of reasons that I can go into during the Q&A, the Russian military has underperformed, which has proven kind of frustrating, I think, to the leadership. And it initially tried to do some sort of pincer type of invasion that did not go well. And as a result, it has resorted to indiscriminate violence, including bombing, using cluster bombs and possibly thermobaric weaponry, which is kind of like almost like a firebomb. And it started to expand its bombing to civilian targets. There are now videos emerging on YouTube and in basically your cable channels are showing the destruction of civilian infrastructure and the loss of life. One person identified, gave a number of around 2,000 Ukrainian civilian deaths so far, but we really have no idea. And so this is a tactic or a method of warfare that the Russian government has used in the past. It used this kind of cluster bombing of civilian targets in Grozny, which is the capital of one of its regions in southern Russia, the region of Chechnya, where there was a civil war. That bombing in 2000 led to approximately 30,000 deaths, which is just shocking to consider this as a possibility in Ukraine. And of course, many of you may know that Russia did this also in the city of Aleppo in Syria in 2016. So on the other hand, I just want to say it is possible that Russia may try to restrain a little bit of its use of indiscriminate violence, because Kyiv and Ukraine more broadly is kind of like the homeland in a sense, especially in the way that Putin is describing it. So it's a little strange to, retake your homeland while you're bombing it into the Middle Ages. But that's a very faint hope. I don't think that's really something, nor do I think that the threats of war crimes, which are quite valid and quite likely to happen, are really going to deter the Putin leadership. So I would say this is a shock, and this is something that I think, we should be prepared to see more of in the coming week, maybe in the coming weeks. Third, we are now watching in real time the unfolding of Europe's worst refugee crisis since World War II. The numbers are staggering. Around 500,000 people have been displaced in the first week. It's now today getting close to about 1 million. And there are predictions that it'll be about 4 million. I've heard numbers up to 10 million. Just for keeping this in perspective, 66% of the world's refugees come from 5 countries. The largest refugee population comes from Syria, which is 6.8 million. And now we're watching the possibility of 4 million people to be displaced from Ukraine. And so this is, I think, something that many of us never thought we would witness in the 21st century, and certainly in Europe in the 21st century. In addition to these shocking developments that have sort of unfolded and were sort of suddenly cropped up on our newsfeed in the last week, this crisis has also illuminated and made very clear the promise and the pitfalls of living in a multipolar system, in a multipolar world. What I mean is we live in a world where the US is not the sole superpower. Yes, we spend, our military expenditure is double that of the rest of the world all put together. And we certainly have, we can project power and we have significant influence economically across the globe. But we cannot just simply dictate policy as we wish and do what we want, where we want it. We live in a world with multiple regional powers, China, Russia, and Western European countries that sometimes don't come on board, sometimes they do. So on one hand, this crisis has made clear the promise of collaboration and coordination in this multipolar world. It has brought together, as Professor Heinz noted, a remarkable feat of unity and multilateralism that we have never seen really over the last, we haven't seen over the last several decades, and it's really pretty impressive. We've seen this in three different areas. The US and NATO have sent troops to NATO countries bordering Ukraine. This has effectively blocked Russia from forays or potentially moving into NATO countries. NATO currently has about 7,500 multinational troops in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. These are countries that border Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And the US has sent more troops there. So this has been a very quick and clear message to the Putin government that there will be a defense of NATO territory, which I think is a good thing, because it clearly draws a line and makes it clear and doesn't, like with a bully, you want to kind of make it clear what is allowed, what is not. Secondly, there's a lot of coordination in arming forces in Ukraine. This is absolutely essential to supporting the defense effort in Ukraine. I don't think I have my doubts about how successful this will be over the long term, but this is certainly making a difference right now on the ground. And then thirdly, as Professor Heinz noted, this is the international community has collaborated quite extensively in bringing about an array of sanctions that won't necessarily change the military dynamics on the ground today or in the coming week or two, but will undermine Russia's long-term military capability. And this is part of the package. The idea is that by effectively blocking Russia from entering NATO countries, Russia may get mired in conflict in Ukraine. It can funnel weaponry to Ukraine. And between all of this that Russia is involved in, plus the long-term erosion of its military capability, means it's going to be less likely to be able to do this kind of thing again in the future. These sanctions are extraordinarily extensive. You've all heard, many of you may have heard them on the news. They include blocking Russian banks from participating in the SWIFT international payment system, so it can't communicate with other banks. There's the unusual step that's been taken to put sanctions on Russia's central bank, which is pretty much almost never done. I don't think it's ever been done. There have been sanctions placed on individual leaders, and one thing to note is that today, in today's world, autocrats and their oligarchic collaborators are somewhat different from the kind of autocrats that existed in the mid 20th century. Autocrats today are maybe deeply corrupt, and the oligarchs around them, they may be deeply corrupt, they may be highly autocratic, but they are also globally connected, and that makes them somewhat vulnerable. So to the extent, and I can talk about citizenship regimes in Western countries as well as property purchases and attempts to kind of curtail this in the Q&A if needed. And then there are international companies that are cutting ties with Russian companies. Now, by the way, as Professor Heinz noted, this is going to be these sanctions are certainly going to have an impact on Russia's ability to wage war in the future and be a military challenge for the US in the future. But in the near term, it's going to have devastating effects on its economy. Inflation is likely to go up, as Professor Hansen noted, it's already up 20%, 30%, and that's going to probably wipe out middle-class savings in the country. Of course, working class and middle-class savings, much like the Weimar Republic of the 1920s, Russia in the 1990s. Russia is likely to default on its international loans. And Russia, as was mentioned, is likely to enter into a multi-year economic depression. By the way, this is also going to impact the region as a whole. You can't put you can't sanction and cut off Russia without cutting off the other countries that are part of the Russia's customs union. It's kind of like a free trade area, kind of like NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. That includes Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia, countries that have no interest or really don't have any, couldn't care less about the Ukrainian, whether Ukraine is independent or not. And now they are caught up in this. And in addition to that, we're likely to see a mass departure of large numbers of migrant laborers from Russia into the countries they originated from. Russia has about 13 million migrants. Some are legal, many are not. We're also likely to see an increase in black market and organized criminal activity across the region as goods become scarce. So there are a whole host of unintended consequences here. But the good news, the promise is that internationally we've seen an unprecedented level of coordination, and it has moved remarkably quickly. And I don't think that this has been, this certainly wasn't predicted by the Putin regime, but even generally speaking, I think that this is quite impressive, and perhaps this is something that we might rely on in the future. The bad news is that the crisis also highlights the shortcomings of how much we can do. As I mentioned, Ukraine is not a NATO member, and as a result, we really cannot enter Ukrainian airspace or territory without potentially ratcheting up into a larger scale war with Russia. I know there's a lot of talk about and concern about nuclear weapons. I think that the lines are pretty clearly drawn, and I don't see that as really an immediate concern. And I would urge people not to get frightened by the kind of rhetoric you might hear or a newscast. Just keep in mind that CNN makes its money by dramatizing the news, or whatever your news outlet is, and so that's one point. And another point is, and so let me just say that this is going to be very difficult for the US and for Western European states to deal with. The fact that we cannot enter militarily into Ukraine over the next several weeks, hopefully much less. We'll see a lot of violence and unfortunate outcomes in Ukraine. And there will be enormous pressure put on the Biden administration to intervene, because I think people will see this on the news. And it's going to be very difficult to deal with civilian deaths and other potential outcomes, and only be able to arm Ukraine, which also, by the way, brings its side an additional set of issues, because it very well, like Afghanistan, may leave Ukraine awash with weapons. And this entire conflict is likely to leave Ukraine a very unstable state in the near future. And finally, sanctions are slow and blunt instruments. They may work fairly well in keeping Russia from developing military capability in the long term, but these are not very effective tools in bringing about regime change. I heard a Biden administration official talking about how this is going to be used recently, yesterday or today, how these sanctions are going to be used to bring about some kind of regime change in Russia. That is also alluded to, was even alluded to in the State of the Union address by President Biden last night. That's not a reliable bet, and that is not a very effective policy, even if it works. Political scientists know that civil society is generally has been weak in Russia. There is a young urban middle class that may protest, and those you may see some of those in the cities across Russia, but those protests remain relatively low in number. There is increasing repression by the Russian state, and to be waiting around for some kind of revolution is that's not a very reliable way to carry out your foreign policy. And nor should we expect some kind of coup to happen from within the KGB or the military or oligarchs. I'm not saying that these things won't happen. I'm just saying that they are notoriously unpredictable, and this is not something that should be part of like a planned foreign policy. And by the way, regime change typically doesn't really turn out well for democracy. Countries that experience revolutionary change or military coup d'etats very rarely end up with thriving democracies. If you think about it, it's not very difficult to understand. These are processes that circumvent the very institutions and the very processes of democracy. They are, by definition, revolution is going around political parties and elections and all the boring stuff that political scientists love to study, legislative behavior and, all that stuff about how you turn a bill into a law. That's democracy. So where does this leave us? What's going to happen? What kind of predictions can we make? I certainly do not know. If I knew that, I would be, shorting stocks and advising governments. But I think that rather than kind of highlight a particular set of outcomes, let me leave you with this general statement that this crisis has crystallized ideological lines across the globe in ways that we haven't really seen. We've seen this kind of divide, this claim that we're fighting for democracy against autocracy. And this is something that the Biden administration and the campaign had noted as well. But this crisis has made that much more clear, that there is an ideological layer on top of global politics that separates democracy from autocracy, separates those countries that are seeking to preserve the liberal international order that we've had in the world since World War II, and those that seek to challenge it. And so this adds a layer or makes things a little bit more difficult for countries as they grapple with crises and how they have to balance this ideological element alongside the very practical politics of trying to make a compromise. So like for the US, while it really can't intervene militarily in Ukraine, how does it claim to be, promoting democracy and upholding all these ideological claims when it can't even save an endangered fledgling democracy or prevent a humanitarian disaster in Europe? What is it going to do if, Ukraine becomes partitioned and the idea of Novorossiya, where Russia extends its borders across southern Ukraine to Romania and pushes the border north of Crimea and extends the borders of the eastern provinces, the Donbass west. So you have kind of like a divided Ukraine. How does the U.S. justify its, ideological stance? And the same goes for China, by the way. China has regularly staked its opposition to U.S. democracy promotion. It's claimed that efforts to violate state sovereignty is a real anathema for it, that it's opposed to this. It preserves state sovereignty at all costs. That's its like one of its founding principles. But that would lead it to, pretty strongly criticize what Russia is doing. On the other hand, on the pragmatic side, it wants to kind of stay in good relations with Russia. Russia has very cheap natural gas and oil, and they align with Russia on a whole different set of issues. So that makes it difficult for them too. By making these ideological parameters clear, this crisis has made it a little more difficult. And that's true for the autocratic fence sitters around the globe. Those countries that are kind of quasi-autocratic, quasi-democratic, Bolsonaro's Brazil, Modi's India, Erdogan's Turkey, Orban's Hungary. So on one hand, the reverberations of this crisis are still quite unclear, but while we're trying to grapple with the shocking changes that we've witnessed over the last week and a half, the shock and horror of seeing our norms and our international borders so flagrantly violated, and trying to grapple with the kind of changes that we're all seeing on the ground and the difficult images we see on TV, then we should also keep in mind that there are some longer term consequences here that are going to shape our international system for years to come. And we are only now just beginning to understand them. I think I'll leave it at that. I don't know if I went over my time. So I guess we'll now open it for questions.
Thank you.
Tabitha? it was applause rather than questions, but I'll go ahead and ask a question that I had in mind, although both presentations were very comprehensive. The question I had was related to China, and China had already stated its I want to say the word support, but it had already indicated to Putin and to Russia that it would not interfere if Russia was to invade during all of this preparation time. I wanted to know why and how does this all line up in terms of the future and the atrocities going on. How does it play out for China in that it early on stated its ambivalence to it openly?
You want to jump on that one, or do you want to take a couple of questions and then?
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah. So I don't know who's next. Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Hey, Doctor, I was curious as to what is that if there was any takeaway from, because this has been something that has been developing from, I think, for the past few months since Ukrainian intelligence reported an uncovered coup d'etat attempt way back in late November, and it's just seemed like for a very long time that the Western world has been, especially from a public standpoint, has been very slow to react. From my personal experience, that a lot of people have been very unaware of this issue until the very moment that Russian soldiers actually entered into Ukraine. Do you think that there's any takeaway from the lack of Western the lack of the public awareness from the things that have escalated in the past few months that have led Vladimir Putin to feel so inclined to do a full-scale invasion into Ukraine?
I mean, I can start with that question. That's a great question. So we don't know what Putin is thinking. We didn't know even the day before he invaded Ukraine what he was thinking. So we just don't know how he looked at the West and regarded it. I would guess that he thought that the West would react the same way that the West reacted the last 3 times that Russia has engaged in military action against one of its neighbors. That would be the 2008 incursion into Georgia, and the 2014 seizure of Crimea, and also the 2014 move into the Donbass and eastern Ukraine. That is, that there were sanctions, but that they had very little bite, and that the West was divided and hesitant to do anything, that it did not accelerate the incorporation, for example, of Ukraine into NATO. In fact, the opposite occurred. NATO became more hesitant and more cautious about taking in either Georgia or Ukraine. They were both NATO offered them both to begin the process of NATO joining NATO in 2007, and Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, which put an end to that idea. So I think that Putin probably has felt that the West was not going to react very much. And I think that the experience with the Trump administration, which was basically that President Trump minimized Putin's, for example, his hacking of his interference with the elections, and that Putin's approach to Trump, or Trump's approach to Putin, seemed to have been to try to charm him rather than lodge any kind of serious security defense against his actions. But these, together with just a general sense I think Putin has of the West as being soft, as being weak, as being over-secularized, as being culturally deficient, and that these things taken together, so this is how I would think that Putin made his decisions about or what he noticed in the slowness of the Western reaction.
I think I'll, thank you, Jim. I think I'll chime in on a couple of those points. I think, and I'll get to the China question in a sec, although I frankly don't know much about China, so I will sort of just speak broadly about that. Alex, what you're alluding to is why did this happen, and how did we not foresee this happening ahead of time, right? And we should have, you know, how do we seem to like miss the boat here?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I was definitely like leading with some of the rhetoric with that, with like the writings are on the wall. You're right.
Right, and there were a number of events that occurred that led up to this, so it didn't come out of nowhere. In November 2013, Ukraine, after having many years being pretty much under a President Yanukovych that was very much pro-Russia. In 2013, in November, there were the so-called Euromaidan protests that deposed him, and then led to, you know, several years of an more independent oriented government under the President Poroshenko, who then was, you know, lost the election to Volodymyr Zelensky in 2019. And throughout those years, and by the way, those protests in 2013 kind of prompted Putin, Russia, to invade and annex Crimea in 2014. That occurs in February and March, like there's 3 months after the Euromaidan protests. And then there's a gradual erosion of relations between Ukraine and Russia over the coming years, where it's increasingly clear that Russia is more frustrated by the more independent nature of the Ukrainian government. Zelensky in particular was much more aggressive than his predecessor Poroshenko in dealing with, in particular, Russian oligarchs, or no, Ukrainian oligarchs, who were very much linked to the Putin regime in Russia. And there was a lot of pressure put on Zelensky in 2020, 2021. There's even an assassination attempt of one of his top officials in August of 21. And so there were certainly signs leading up to this. And then there was a broader context that goes back further to the, you know, several years before this, even before the 2013 protests. I think that, why do we miss this? Well, I think there are many people who are in my little network and circle of people who study the region with a focus on political science, who are doing mea culpas right now, saying we missed the boat big time. We didn't predict it. Some people published articles. There was an article published by 2 prominent experts in the Washington Post in December 21 saying Putin would not invade. And they're having a hard time nowadays going around doing Zoom sessions like this. I would say that I have a lot of it. I don't know why exactly. I think the discipline and the study has moved away from individual leadership studies and more focused on regression analyses and mass participation and things like that are easier to study. It's very hard to kind of read the mind of a single dictator. And so there's a tendency to kind of do that, to move away from that. The US intelligence seemed to have it pretty well. They pretty much understood what was going on, but I think that the options are limited. As I mentioned in the talk, I don't think there were many things that were possible given the fact that Russia possesses nuclear weapons, and there just is only a series of possible responses that one could make. Ukraine, after all, is a sovereign, independent country. You can't just force it to do something. So, and then in relation to the question about China, you know, it's not clear about how China is reacting to this, but they have, one thing to note is that they've made a slight change in their rhetoric. They've made a couple of more critical statements towards Russia in the coming last day or two. That indicates that they're not happy with the way things are going. This doesn't look good for relationships, security in the region, and international security in general creates problems with the global economy. And so, you know, and I've seen people talk about China as talking about how they touch on their relationship to Taiwan and South China Sea, but they take a much more slower and more sophisticated and more subtle effort to extend their influence. And they do have military interests, but they tend not to do this kind of invasion, although who knows at this point, and now we don't know. But I will say that China right now is watching this very clearly and learning what is permissible and what is not permissible. So who's next? Do you want to, Sean? Oh, actually, we have a bunch of students there in a class with a hand up. Hanum. That's what the, yeah.
Hi,
yes,
thank you for your time today. My name is Ryan, and I'm here with Rowan's Model United Nations class. So I would like you to provide us with a modern definition of propaganda. And my question for you is, how can the average citizen discern whether they're viewing propaganda-related media?
Well, why don't we take that and think about that one? I'll rely on Jim to definitely do that. Let's go and get one or two more questions, and then so I'll go to Sean Fisher, and then Sean French.
How's everyone doing? So my question, and I could ask a bunch, but the one I will ask is, I understand from several media reports that about 7,000 Russian citizens have been arrested in protests related to this war. In context, is that a sizable number? Can we expect more of that? And what does that say, about domestically, what Putin's endgame can possibly be here if that is significant domestic unrest? I have to imagine that won't get any better as reports come back about Russian soldiers dying in the war or struggles likewise. So your perspective on that would be appreciated.
Well, I'll answer that question, and I'll let Larry define propaganda. Yeah, so is that a lot of people? Well, in a way it is, because the people who go out on the streets understand very well that they will likely be arrested. It's against the law in Russia to have a protest of more than one person without permission in advance. If it's one person with a sign, that's legal, although not encouraged. And more than one person is considered to be an unsanctioned demonstration. So people understand this. They understand this from the number of arrests that have happened in recent years over the Navalny situation, his arrest and his poisoning. And in previous years, there were even larger protests. The law has changed recently to make it more difficult to protest. So people know that they're risking their freedom, their liberty, and very often, a lot of the people who are getting arrested are students, and they will be kicked out of their programs. They'll probably be encouraged to emigrate. Every once in a while, they might get kicked around in a jail cell. So, it's a lot of people considering all that. What typically happens in these Russian protests is that the first day there's a lot, the second day there are fewer, and the third day and so on. And that's because the consequences are becoming apparent to people. So it's heroic and it's brave. It's as you say, Sean. During the Afghanistan war, the Russian Afghanistan war in 1979 through 1989, there was a group of women who were mothers of Afghani war soldiers, and there was not really public reporting about the deaths of Russian soldiers in Afghanistan, and there wasn't reporting about their deaths, and there wasn't good information given to the families of veterans who died in Afghanistan. And this was during the Gorbachev years when reform was just beginning, and the mothers of those soldiers turned out to be a sort of major moral force in the country. And it's possible that we'll see the same kind of thing. There's not good information from the military now, apparently. I heard today that they finally reported that there were Russian war deaths. Something like 500 people had died, which is a big number, considering that there were almost no reports before this. It may be that you again have a kind of, that becomes a movement of respected moral voices in society that are complaining and horrified and maybe unify a little bit to protest. A related question, I don't want to say the bigger question, but a related question is, how are the elites reacting? And what we're seeing is that some business elites are cautiously speaking out against the war, cautiously and in sort of veiled language. But this is new. Putin is used to having full unanimity of the elites behind him. So if we see cracks in the wealthy classes, the business elites, the people who own these businesses that are being so affected by the sanctions. I mean, I saw today that I think it's Gazprom, which is I believe it's the biggest company in the country. Its stock price today was down close to nothing. I mean, they're losing tremendous amount of value. And the people who have big investments in those, maybe they'll start to say something, but it's a dictatorship. It's not a place where people can speak out freely. I've heard people complain, why aren't the Russians on the streets? Well, it's very, very dangerous to be on the streets. So we can't blame Russian people for not protesting. I hope that answered your question, Sean.
I'll take the propaganda question and think about it a little bit more broadly about the role of misinformation in the crisis, because obviously we live in a world where misinformation and disinformation is a very prominent aspect, and it certainly is a major issue for global security. And I think there's kind of good news and bad news here with this particular crisis. I mean, there's no doubt the bad news is that Putin has so far been fairly effective in maintaining pretty good informational control over the public in terms of the public's access to information. I mean, of course, people have access, and some people can get access to independent sources of information, but the vast majority of people are really quite uninformed or underinformed. They know that there's a military operation of some kind in Ukraine. It's not big on their radar screen. If you stop them on the street and ask them, at least according to the videos that I've seen online and some of the expert opinions I've sat in on their sessions, and they, the Russian government has been playing down this conflict, and so I think that the public as a whole has not fully been informed about this, and it's against the law in Russia to refer to the conflict as a war. It has to be referred to as some kind of other kind of euphemism. The good news is that in addition to miscalculating a number of things in this conflict, the Putin government, the Putin regime, really miscalculated not only the Ukrainian response, but the role of information that has been effectively used by the Ukrainian government, by the Ukrainian population. And this is going to be a problem if it extends and broadens its use of violence, its attacks on civilians, because it's all on video, it's all on the news, and it's no longer easy to carry out kind of like a secret war like you might do in Afghanistan. And one other thing is, and there may be rising dissent as more information seeps into Russia, and they claim that they lost 500 people. Well, it's probably close to 5,000. There's the number of soldiers who have been killed, at least according to unverified reports. And there's also some evidence that they're not collecting bodies purposely to keep the body counts low. But, it's a pretty rudimentary attempt to control information. It doesn't really work in a digital age. So I think that this is a big question. And, I think that this is a very interesting dynamic or variable in the conflict overall. Should we go to another question?
There's a question in the chat section here that I thought was very interesting. This is from William Cameron, who is asking, who are Putin's most trusted advisors? Do you think they advised him against this, or are they fully on board with him?
I'm William Cameron. I'm also known as Todd. I'm a friend of Jim, so I'm curious to hear him answer. Hi, how you doing?
Hey, what's up?
Hey, I'm good. I'm good.
One of my running buddies.
Yes.
I mean, I think Larry may know about the specifics of Putin's inner circle in terms of the names of everybody, and their positions precisely. But the inner circle is small and shrinking, and this is one thing that you've read a lot about, is that some people are comparing this invasion to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, when Brezhnev and maybe 3 or 4 other people made the decision to invade without really informing people outside of that very narrow circle. And it may be that Putin did the same thing. According to a lot of accounts, like a lot of the soldiers who were in Ukraine thought they were going on a training mission.
Yeah.
And this would help to explain the speed of the invasion and the lack of preparation, it seems, in many ways, of a lot of the troops. The people who are closest to him are the head of the domestic security force, the head of the foreign security force. Is basically, they call them the Silovki, the heads of the security services and the military.
Yeah.
So it's, there's not a lot of consultation outside of that circle. You've seen the pictures of Putin at those huge tables with nobody near him.
Yes.
And, this may be a metaphor for his kind of closing worldview, where he's trusting fewer and fewer people. So that would be how I would answer that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. We really have, I think academics don't know. Maybe a few people down in, in security agencies in Langley or something know this, but this is kind of like the $64,000 question. Nobody really knows what's going on in the mind of Putin, and who are the people who are whispering in his ear. On a side note, with regard to that long table, that reminds me of this cartoon I saw of Putin, at one of those long tables, safe from COVID, infected by history. Just want to throw that out there that, maybe Jim is perhaps partly at fault here. But I think that there are definitely a lot of signs that his circle of advisors who knew about this invasion ahead of time are very few. In addition to the things that Jim noted, the medical, I think some of the people I think the medical services were complaining that they didn't have, or emergency services complaining that they didn't have foreknowledge of this, and there's a lot of indications that this was not really thought through. And also, by the way, this is actually, both invasions in 2014 and 2022 of Ukraine were carried out with not much foreknowledge and not much attention to detail. Both were done, with a lot of blind assumptions in place. Someone noted in a thing I attended today that Ukraine doesn't have a focus in its policy circles or its academic circles on analyzing Ukraine. I'm sorry, Russia doesn't have anything in its policy or academic circles for analyzing Ukraine. It's kind of like almost like a domestic issue for them. They don't really have like a cadre of experts on Ukraine. And so in many ways, the regime in both cases went in kind of blindly in 2014 and 2022. It's just that it was a very different situation, and it was a different kind of incursion, and it was a different time. Things have changed markedly in Ukraine since 2014. So unfortunately, I don't think, many of us have much information about that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
Jimmy?
go ahead, Hugh.
Thank you. Your remarks prompt this question. The world has changed from 2014 to 2022. And the one thing that I notice as the signal difference is that there are all these non-government actors like Elon Musk who can intervene and can actually do something that's helpful to the Ukrainians, because the governments are restrained by their ties to other governments, and they can only do so much, or they have nuclear weapons and they're terrified that if they do something, they'll trigger a nuclear war. So, but Mr. Musk isn't. And the same's true with the banks. All the central banks have basically impoverished the Russians. They won't pay the Russians for the money that the Russians are holding, for the fiat currencies the Russians are holding. So I'd really appreciate your perspective on how technology has made it possible for these private parties and non-state actors to exert influence that they didn't have beforehand. And then the second part of the question is, do you foresee that the Ukrainians could copy the tactics of the Chechens and basically terrorize the Russians?
Do you want to take one more question and then we can kind of answer those? Just let's go to Sean French.
Hi, thank you for putting on the talk today and your analysis on this. I'll be clear that I'm not an apologist for Russia, but I want to preface that with this question and qualify it. Is there such a thing as going too far? There's been a lot of talk in the discussion today and previously about the impact of the sanctions, the ruble falling, company valuations dropping completely, and the potential for long-term impact and what that does to middle and working class Russians. So I was wondering if there's such a thing as going too far in isolating Russia. And if in a more, not just an economic sense, but also, I guess, on the academic level of academic exchanges where you could have Russian professors and students no longer be able to come to America or European countries or any country that decides to cut ties.
Yeah, thank you, Sean, for that question. I think that a lot of people are asking that question, and it's tragic that the Russian, as Larry and I have said, the Russian middle class and ordinary people are going to be badly affected by this, and it's it's really unfortunate. I'm not quite sure how to resolve that, how to deal with that tension. You sanction a country, it hurts the economy. Of course, the wealthier people, they may lose more in terms of dollars, but they're not going to have their livelihoods and their ordinary lives affected as much as ordinary people will. When you talk about academics, I'm certainly concerned that I may not be able to go to Russia to do my research in the future. That worries me. These things become politicized in a way that they haven't been since the Cold War. I was able to go to Russia in 1983 and 1990 as a sort of innocent student, and I was considered to be a person who was outside of politics. And now, you get concerned that a lot of people are being victimized by politics, and it's just the nature of the game, I guess. I noticed today. I don't like seeing that. For example, I'll mention something that people are being caught up in, like athletes are being caught up in politics. So a lot of athletic events are being canceled. Well, athletes have nothing to do with this, and it hurts the athletes. And there is this, sports is ideally above politics. That's the principle of the Olympic Games. And we see sports being affected just like domino effect, where nobody's willing to go to Russia, nobody's willing to host Russian athletes anymore. So that's disappointing to me. And as far as going too far goes, it's just I think it's interesting. I think that we don't always understand what the effects of the sanctions are going to be. So there are some unintended consequences of sanctions as well.
On that last question, I think there is a lot of debate right now among some of my peers about whether or not Western US and Western European institutions should end agreements and partnerships with institutions, educational institutions, and end academic exchange. And I think that raises a question. On one hand, those arrangements may provide funding for those institutions, those educational institutions, and it kind of subsidize the Russian state. And therefore, a lot of people who are, say, Professor Heinz and my colleagues in Ukraine might feel strongly about that being a good thing. On the other hand, shouldn't it also be one situation where you keep those lines open? And these are the very people that should be communicating with one another. Academic exchange should continue. So it's a very complicated issue. And with reference to the other question, the other two questions, the question about technology is a very good one. I absolutely agree that technology is a new factor that wasn't really quite clear in 2014 and is much more prevalent, especially because Zelensky himself is quite adept at using technology in making these videos and speaking directly to the public, whereas the Putin leadership is, for however you may judge the Putin leadership, one thing you can evaluate is its effectiveness in its media campaign, and it's not very good. It's doing these kind of staged presentations where you see like the advisors on one side, Putin on the other, or he's hearing all the reports and he's nodding very knowledgeably. Meanwhile, you have Zelensky out there making these, speaking in multiple languages and looking quite not only telegenic, but also very skilled in his speeches and his presentation style and his use of technology. And then also technology is obviously impactful in the ways with Elon Musk and the use of technology, not only by non-state actors, but by state actors, and effectively bringing about such a wide range set of sanctions is also somewhat new. I've heard Sovietologists or former Soviet experts say sanctions are not going to work. Russia has been evading sanctions for like 40 years, or in the Soviet Union even longer. So you're talking about like 70 years of sanctions. They know how to beat this, but we now live in a global economy that is, integrated with all sorts of technological capabilities. And so I think that is definitely a factor, and non-state actors are also important too. With reference to I think the question about will Ukrainians do some kind of similar thing to the kind of shift towards terrorist attacks in Russia, that was carried out by a small group of people from Chechnya. That was certainly not a Chechen response. Chechnya and Chechens suffered enormously because of these conflicts, just to make sure that's clear. But I think it raises a broader question about what's going to happen in Ukraine. If things go poorly for Ukraine, how will that, it's already going poorly, but if Ukraine is occupied and maybe part of Ukraine is occupied, part is not, what kind of occupation will that be? Does Russia have the capabilities to maintain that kind of occupation? Would that be an occupation that faces a rural insurgency or an urban, uprising type of thing? If this uprising or this insurgency emerges and is getting support from the West, would that not provide incentive or opportunity and justification for greater use of force by the Russian government, and almost legitimize the kind of blanket use of force that we kind of see and we're worried about? I think it's one thing that I think we do know is that Russia doesn't have the capability to occupy Ukraine and govern Ukraine over the long term with such opposition among the population. It just doesn't have the infrastructure, doesn't have the capability to do that. And frankly, most countries can't. The United States has much more capability and much more power and much more economic capability, and it didn't do very well in its occupations and attempts to establish government where it wasn't wanted in other places. So there are a lot of questions about what is the future for Ukraine.
There are some questions in the chat that look pretty interesting that I thought might be good to bring up. The first one is from Dr. Kerrigan, asking about the Biden administration's handling. So your evaluations of the Biden administration thus far. And then the second question is about the fact that, so I'm just going to read it because it says, can you say a bit more, this is from Dr. Clapper, can you say a bit more about what nationalism and patriotism mean to Ukraine, given the relatively short history of Ukraine as an independent state and the linguistic and other different groups who live there?
Let's see. um, I'll tell you what I think about the Biden administration's handling of the crisis so far. And I would judge by how well he was able to rally support for sanctions in Europe. And I think he gets an A+ for that. Now, the Biden administration isn't the only actor here, but he was the leader of the movement to apply sanctions. And as Larry talked earlier about how unified the European allies are. I mean, the European Union, to impose sanctions on Russia, has to have a unanimous vote of, I believe it's 27 states that really have a lot of trouble voting unanimously about anything, but they did vote unanimously. And a lot of people attribute that to the way Biden, spoke to them and persuaded them and was just talked back and forth and negotiated with them. So I think that, the United States showed a lot of strength and leadership on this issue. It's not easy to persuade Europe to do anything. So let's see, what was the second question? Oh, it was Melissa's question about
Ukrainian nationalism.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very complicated sort of issue. I'm not a specialist in Ukrainian nationalism, but you're absolutely right that Ukraine has a lot of different ethnic groups, has a lot of different, there's a large Russian-speaking population, there's a large Ukrainian population. There are other ethnicities there, there's a large Jewish population in some of the cities. I think that what historians normally say is that initially there was a kind of cultural nationalism, and the cultural nationalism comes into existence in the 19th century when there are nationalist movements in a lot of small states in Europe and in Eastern Europe. It's when Czech nationalism and Slovakian nationalism and Polish nationalism all become coherent movements, even though they're not the only ethnicities in their territories. They all develop nationalist movements that emphasizes language, especially, but also music and art and history of those people. So I would say that Ukraine has largely this kind of cultural nationalist movement, but by the 1920s and especially by the 1990s, this nationalism becomes more focused on creating a unitary state, and it becomes a kind of state-focused nationalism, and that's where it is now. It's all about having an independent state that is multinational, but that has a major Ukrainian presence and Ukrainian domination, but with the participation of other groups. So,
yeah, I can comment on Ukrainian nationalism. I think it is very complicated, and there's just sort of a little bit of history here, and then there's also recent developments. Historically, the Soviet Union, of course, was very repressive and did a lot to undermine the independent, potentially oppositional mobilization of groups based on their nationality, and was certainly repressive in Ukraine. Everybody knows about or people frequently refer to in the news about the Holodomor, the state-sponsored or state-affected famine in the 1930s that was designed to really kind of break the back of Ukrainian resistance. And so there's close to 5 million people who lost their lives in that. But on the other hand, like in Ukraine, but also other parts of the Soviet Union, the Soviet structure essentially territorialized ethnic identity. It's an ethno-federal system. It's a federalized country. Like we have states, they had republics, except their republics are drawn around ethnic lines. So it's been noted that the Soviet Union was kind of like an incubator of ethnicity. The thing is that in the case of Ukraine, you had a sort of like a longstanding cultural division where Eastern Ukraine tended to be a little bit more Russian oriented with ties to Russia. They tended to be more likely to speak Russian as their first language, whereas Western Ukraine tended to be more speaking Ukrainian first rather than Russian. And so there has been sort of a sense or a belief, at least in the post-Soviet period, that Eastern Ukraine may have more ties culturally and perhaps even politically to Russia. And they certainly have economic ties, and there's a lot of family ties too, a lot of People have relatives in one country versus the other that extend over the border. And in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and moved its, little green men, its secret little soldiers over there to take over the eastern provinces or the Donbass region, there was actually a little bit of defection from some of the local leaders, and even one of their naval officers defected, a pretty prominent guy who brought a bunch of ships over to the Russian side. But there is a vast difference between having language and cultural and family ties and wanting to give up your country's sovereignty. So while there's a large number of people who may be Russian speaking and may feel affiliations to Russia, almost nobody, even in Eastern Ukraine, has an interest in giving up their sovereignty and being part of Russia. And that was a huge miscalculation by the Putin leadership, it seems. And over the course in the last several years since 2014, there's also been increasing, Ukraine has been in a war. It's been a low intensity conflict since 2014. And this has energized Ukrainian nationalism and has helped kind of bind together people more towards the state. But even then, I think there was a strong sense, there may have been a strong sense of Ukrainian nationalism and a sense of being Ukrainian, which is not so much, it's more like a civic, it's not so much tied to having blood ties. It's kind of a more multinational or a multi-ethnic notion of Ukrainian citizenry. But certainly there's no doubt that the recent conflict has just energized, and it's not just a quick rally around the flag type of dynamic. There's no doubt that now there's a huge wave of Ukrainian nationalism and real opposition to Russian involvement and occupation in the country. And I think that's why Jim mentioned earlier in the session that he doesn't see Russia getting Ukraine ever. And I think that's right. I think, in a sense, it's lost it. And not that it ever had it, but there's no real sentiment in Ukraine now. And so we see, I think it's important to note that ethnic identity and national identity are socially constructed, and they're in many ways kind of invented. And they're certainly shaped by current events and developments. And we see this as the conflict has energized and strengthened a sensibility of being Ukrainian and defining it in some ways in a new way.
Yeah, another accidental consequence of Putin's invasion is to strengthen the very nationalism that he hates so much. I think there's a
Jim, you're muted.
Yes, maybe we should take these last two questions, Mom's iPhone and Melissa. I think you're muted. I think we can't hear you.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay. I thought it was fixed. Anyway, I'm Elizabeth Foltz. I'm from the mathematics department, and I just had a quick question. That was, could either of you comment on what you think the, I would say over the next year or maybe the next 2 years, what the implications of this will be for American politics, in the sense that, I grew up in the, USSR years and got involved in politics when our relationship with the Soviet Union was sort of issue number one frequently. Our relationship with Russia hasn't been issue number one for quite some time. So I'm just kind of wondering if anybody has any perspective on how this will affect American politics over the next maybe year or so.
Yep. And Melissa?
Hi, thanks so much. So, we've talked about this as it's framing it more as an ideological struggle, right? Like challenging the post-war, world order at this point. The world has stepped up and has done a lot to help, but it feels like they're starting to reach the point that they can't really do too much anymore. Do you think that there is or should be a line in the sand for the West to step in militarily? I know that isn't very palatable, but what if the situation starts to turn to things that are non-starters for democracy? If we start seeing political prisoners rounded up and, God forbid, executed and things of that nature. If the situation really turns dire and this truly is being framed as this ideological democratic versus dictatorship, do you think that we might have to step in a little bit more?
Thanks. Two questions asking for predictions.
Do you want to go first or should I?
Why don't you go first?
Okay. With regard to the influence on American politics, it certainly will become a political football. It'll be an issue in the 2022 elections and the 2024 election. No doubt, this is a conflict that's going to be with us for quite some time. It's going to be used by both parties. Ironically, I'm a little worried about the unity of support that Biden got after the State of the Union and the general support he got for his comments on Ukraine, because I could see him seeing this as a good instrument for binding together. This is a big thing for him, binding together the increasingly fragmented American public, and perhaps using this ideological framework to try to do that. And that in turn leads us, would kind of lead to the second question about, if we're continuing to hear this ideological drumbeat, how is it possible to balance this if we in turn see a lot of problematic developments in Ukraine? I think it'll be a bit of a fix for a number of countries. Legally speaking, countries are not allowed to intervene in the internal politics of another country unless there's a clear sign of genocide occurring. But this is obviously, you have the country's asking to have intervention, so that doesn't apply. I think there might be some red lines, but it's very hard to imagine red lines that would justify the threat of a small-scale nuclear conflict or potential nuclear conflict. So it's a very upsetting set of developments, and I don't really see a very easy conclusion. And I've been thinking about this for the last 7 days of trying to figure out what could be the out, and I don't have one. And I do think that's a very serious question. I really don't have an answer.
I mean, I'll just quickly agree with Larry that it's such a difficult thing. Some people are calling for a no-fly zone in Ukraine. That is asking for NATO to block any Russian air activity in NATO. But that is a declaration over Ukraine. But that's a declaration of war because we would be shooting down their planes and they would be shooting down our planes. And the leaders are not willing to do that yet. And I don't see it happening, anytime soon. I just don't. It's a sad situation. If Russia is able to occupy Ukraine, then what will happen? And Larry talked about some of these possible outcomes, and none of them are any good. As far as American politics goes, I try not to pay too much attention to what the politicians are saying about this situation. To me, it's something that should be left out of American politics naively. You naively hope that there would be unity on this, but I have seen that some people are, as Larry said, both sides are trying to make political hay out of it. I do kind of just puzzle at people who say that that Biden lost Ukraine, or Biden, allowed for the invasion, or, there were no invasions of, no countries were invaded when the previous president was president. To me, this is just silly and distressing at the same time. So as Larry said, I think that this will be a big issue in the 2022 and 2024 campaigns. Typically, Americans don't vote based on foreign policy, but this may be a type of issue that has really captured people's imagination. A lot of people are following it, and there's a lot of sympathy for Ukraine, and narratives about the heroism of the president, and if something happens to him, would that be a big turning point in people's attitudes towards whether this our position is a success or not? So, yeah, I don't see too much good coming out of that. So it is 6:30. I'm willing to stick around for a little bit more. I want to thank everybody for coming, though. You know, I don't know about you, Larry. You want to stick around for a little bit more, or do you have something to do? Or
Sure, I'll stay for a bit if there are some lingering questions, but
there's a couple. Yeah, there's lingering questions. Otherwise, I don't see any new hands. So maybe we should just say thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see such a big turnout, and it's been great having Larry as listening to Larry talk about these things. Really fascinating. Great to have such a colleague. And
yeah, same here. And thank you all for your interest in this very in this part of the world. And you know, hopefully we'll have another session sometime in the future, and the circumstances will be much better.
Exactly. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
So let's.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine, if you can stick around for a minute.
Sure thing.
Thanks. One reason is because there's so many comments in the chat. I would like to see them before we exit out. Hi, Carolyn. Oh, gone. Oh, there she is.
Oh, Sean, you got a question?
Yeah, I do, if nobody else is going to ask one. You know, Joe Biden as a political figure has been, I'll just use the term, like a foreign policy, you know, he's part of the broader foreign policy community. He chaired foreign relations. He was vice president for 8 years. He's president now. He and Putin have interacted plenty of times before. What is that relationship like? I wouldn't say it's trusting, but to the degree they have interacted, like what is their relationship like?
Putin and Biden, you're saying?
Yes. So they've interacted a few times before. I know they met when he was vice president. They've met once, I believe, now. But Biden's been around. So as a global figure, he's been a United States foreign policy entity for the duration of Putin's time in power. So do they have, what is that relationship like, I guess, if there is any intel on that?
I'll say that a couple of things. First of all, that you know, if you recall, a number of administrations have tried to do Russian resets, and you know, George W. Bush and Obama have both tried that, and I think that the conclusion now is that they've been burned, and they don't really extend much trust to what Putin says. Also, when he meets with world leaders, you know, he does a shtick where he basically sits, first of all, he shows up late all the time. And then he, just to throw people off. And then he does this like 1 hour long, maybe even an hour and a half history of how Russia's been wronged and how this, and then he sets this, you know, the context. And then he's like, after all of that, you're just like dazed and bored or tired. And he's like, okay, now let's get started. And then negotiates with you. So he's a tough negotiator. I don't think there's any love lost between Putin and Biden. I think there was a more warmer sense between Obama and Putin, but now there's a sense that maybe whatever kind of warmth Obama had towards him, not warmth, but like a possibility of extending goodwill was not reciprocated. And I think that there's a lot of much more cautious a sense about how to relate to Putin. And I, you know, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I don't have anything special to say about that. But you're right that Putin has been Biden's been dealing with Putin forever. You know, when he was head of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, he also was very actively. I think they met in 2008, right? So I would guess that Biden is, Biden definitely during this crisis has shouted him down repeatedly. He made a point of just saying he's lying, he's lying, he's lying. And this was very interesting, this information campaign to say that Russia was about to invade Ukraine. And a lot of people didn't believe it. Like, a lot of people were skeptical, and they had it right on the nose. And that, clearly was intentional and probably helped. It probably helped the Ukrainians prepare, and it helped prepare public opinion. It wasn't a surprise to the United States when it happened. And that probably helps them politically. It's not like it was a Pearl Harbor type attack in the middle of the night. We should have been prepared. A lot of people didn't want to listen, particularly, but to me, that's a show of strength against Putin. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think so. James, do you have a question?
Yes, I do actually. I wanted to hold it because I wanted to give the students a chance to talk, but I've been thinking about this, particularly from the left. You see this dominant discourse to blame this on NATO, and I certainly think NATO expansion played a part, but to be frank, it doesn't seem like Ukraine had a snowball's chance in hell of joining NATO. And not only because it didn't meet the standards, but also because France, Germany, also Hungary, Czech Republic, et cetera, opposed its membership. And I was thinking about other reasons why this occurred. And I was wondering what you thought of this one. So it seemed like for a few people are discussing that Ukraine last year reapplied for EU membership. And this is something that Russia's been really opposed to as well, not only for Ukraine, but for example, when Moldova tried to join the EU. First, Russia cut off its wine exports and then reduced Russian gas to Moldova. So I was just wondering what you think of that explanation.
Yeah, I think that, every time that in 2007, 2008, there was efforts by Ukraine and Georgia to consider, they were making initial steps to join NATO. And in the wake of that, I think that was part of the reason why Russia did that incursion into Georgia in 2008. But I agree that I don't think that Ukraine or Georgia really had any real chance of joining NATO in reality, even if it met the standards at some point down the road. I think that was sort of like, if you think about red lines, that's certainly red lines for Putin, and he's pretty much said as much. And one might go back and think about perhaps, it's up to every country to decide their fate, but perhaps it would have been a little less politicized if, certain countries in Western Europe or the US would have said, maybe Ukraine might make some connections to the West, but we're not in any hurry. We have no interest in, bringing it into NATO. It's up to it to decide, but in retrospect, that may have been true. I think that would be a very compelling argument like 2 weeks ago. But after hearing Putin give that diatribe, that crazy speech that he gave on Monday, where he referenced all those historical falsehoods and has this image of basically occupying, rebuilding or restating the Russian Empire, it almost makes it feel like it's almost like an inevitable conflict. I mean, I know that's a big no-no in any kind of discipline, including history, but it certainly feels that way. One wonders, like, what could Ukraine have done to avoid the situation? I mean, other than basically becoming like a little proto-state of Russia. So.
Right. Well, I think we should wrap it up here.
Yeah.
Thanks for you guys who stuck around, and appreciate it. I hope this was informative.
Yeah. Thanks, Jim, for taking the lead and steering us through this.
Yeah, thank you, James, for organizing it. and Kathy for helping. Maybe the both of you organized it.